perhaps in the way which I would like to continue this conversation, from very sociological to more, perhaps a bit more practical and less of theoretical. So I will start with the basically the three takeaways which I think, or I hope, that you will have from this presentation. First is that you will have maybe a sense of the geopolitical context and under which the interconfessional relationships have developed in the very, very recent past in this country, and also the local responses to the elite narratives, the top-down elite narratives, the political side of this, but also the very much detailed, nuanced interconfessional relations. But again, because of the time constraints, I'll be open for your questions in the discussion time. But a bit of theorizing about the modes of interconfessional competition will also be a part of the story today. And I will also delve deeper into the organizational discontents, especially between the two churches, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, or Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Moscow Patriarchate. So a bit of the agency's perspective. And in here, I mean the role of the people, the feeling of the people from the grassroots fieldwork, which I've done in Ukraine for the past 3 years. And by the way, now I'm greeting you from the mountainous Georgia, where I'm now in the fieldwork. So if there is a problem with the internet, please blame it on the mountains of Georgia. So I would look at the very macro level, as we call it in sociology, in the macro level, how and why certain narratives evolved, and actually what affected those narratives. So what effects did post-revolutionary structural changes have on the national identity in Ukraine? That was the question that many sociologists asked and political scientists asked after the Revolution of Dignity. And Ukraine became more Ukrainian, argued a prominent historian, Dominic Arel, in terms of the strengthening the fluid identity boundaries. But what those boundaries really meant was an interesting question for us, or others showed how different dimensions of ethnicity, individual language preferences, language embeddedness, ethno-linguistic identity, and national identity were very important features which must have been given more attention for understanding the choices, public choices, or even the voting behavior, as we will see later. Another issue was, of course, the language practice, which is a very significant issue and a powerful predictor of political attitudes, right? Or some scholars, such as yet another prominent Ukrainian scholar, Volodymyr Kulik, said the bottom-up de-Russification was occurring in Ukraine, in the post-revolutionary Ukraine. But again, if we look at these levels, there is, on both macro and micro levels, there is a substantive absence of religion. So is religion an important feature of Ukrainian identity, or is it not? Both mono and bilingual notions of native language, as I say here, are significantly associated with self-identification, right? The research which Gwendolyn Sasse and Lacker showed very recently. But what about religion? How were the church-state relations and interdenominational relationships in Ukraine affected by these structural changes? We have to go back to the elephant in the room again in the next slides, but without the sociology's relationship to orthodoxy, we will be having issues of maybe giving a little bit of the reductionist perspective without delving deeper into the how sociology actually theorizes Orthodox Christianity. And I argue that the story of the most under-theorized of all Christianities is the story of sociology and Orthodox Christianity. Why? Because there is a surprising absence of, not so much of the books, but actually of the theorizing about the Orthodox Christianity on both macro, micro, and even meta level, and to a few great books which were written by the prominent scholars such as John Burgess or Kirill Hovorun or Nancy Ammerman, looking at religion from a different perspective. But very often these perspectives were Russian-centric, or were underestimating the role of the agency So I hope my voice is still there. I hope you can still hear me. If you could just give me a thumb. I see Thomas here. If you can give me a thumb up, good. Because I'm struggling with not seeing that many people, because I reduced it to the absolute minimum to focus on the lecture. So Ukraine is actually by default very uniquely plural in terms of the religious field. And if we look at the and I hope you can see here the Christian composition of, for example, Christian Orthodoxy constitutes 64.9%, Greek Catholics 9.5%, and etc. So you will see the presence of, again, a pluralism by default, what we call. But Father Nicholas mentioned in his lecture that an interesting group of Christians, which are just Orthodox, constitute 30.3% of the overall population. So again, we can see here the Ukrainian Church of Kiev Patriarchate with 7.7%, and the 10.6% of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And the new church, the newly created church, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, with 13.2%, with 3.1% according to the Razumkov Center's polls being undecided. So this is the kind of fluctuations within the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. But if we look at the parishes, the number of parishes, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate has considerable amount, and it is actually the dominant in terms of the numbers of parishes. And you can see 12.3 thousand parishes, as opposed to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine with 7,000 parishes. But if you look at the church buildings, and I'll look at why these details are so important in this kind of the spatial framing of nationhood, or the concepts of nationhood, as seen from the perspective of the churches. So the church buildings, Orthodox Church of, again, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate here is 11,157 buildings, as opposed to the 5.2 thousand of the new church. So these are the striking differences in terms of the spatial dimensions, where actually the physical churches are present, which are the areas, which are the patterns by which these churches were being built, and what is the nature of the conflict around these churches? What is the sort of the political dimension of these conflicts between the different denominations? So I'll be talking about essentially two competing discourses of identity, which I identified in my book, which was out this year, but also in my other work on Ukraine, forthcoming work on Ukraine. The first narrative is the Russian world. I'll go deeper into this later, but very basically, to give you the recap, this is basically a historical fusion between Orthodoxy and Russian nationalism in certain forms. Another is the dimension of the Russian world is its hybridity of faith, culture, and a civilizational narrative, right? But opposed to that, we've seen a rise and perhaps rise and fall, depending how we measure it, of the discourse of unified state, united church, which was advocated by the former president Poroshenko, and which had a very strong emphasis on the strong army, distinctive language, and local religious tradition, which was actually the backbone for the Ukrainian autocephaly, which came in 2019. In my fieldwork, I was fascinated by the presence of religion in the public space, or as we've seen here, in a public space, both with the highest state officials, and we can see here the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, Filaret, with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and his wife Marina, taking part in March during religious processions, which actually marked the anniversary, 1030th anniversary of the day of baptism of Kievan Rus, a very important day for the Christianity, both in Ukraine and in Russia, for very political or geopolitical reasons, as we'll get back to that later. So rhetorically speaking, and I'm not going to be boring you too much with a lot of quotes, but I have to show you the sort of the gist of the political rhetoric, as well as the reflections from the field, reflections which I find very interesting for understanding the phenomenon of autocephaly, as well as interconfessional denomination. So this is a quote from the President Poroshenko. You can read it. So basically, a body cannot be free, he says, when the soul is in captivity. And there is an interesting fusion, if you will, of the geopolitical or national security dimension with the Christianity, with the independence of the church. So he says, the Thomas of the autocephaly for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine goes far beyond the religious issue. It is of the same level with strengthening of the army, protection of the language, struggle of membership of the EU, NATO. This is yet another strategic benchmark, says the president, on our historic path. This is a significant component of our independence. And we can, if we kind of in a way zoom out from this quote and see in the bigger picture, the sort of small details of how the architecture of the autocephaly and what was the trajectory of the autocephaly on the political level, we will see that the president himself was very much involved in this project. He was personally visiting, personally advocating, and significantly perhaps misunderstanding the role of religion for his voters, but definitely going almost all in his political capital for captivating the religious nation-state argument in his favor, which actually we've seen didn't work that much by the result of the elections, which brought Zelensky as a president. But we also saw very interesting symbolic presence of religion and conflict in the space of church. This is an icon of Christ, which I took picture of in Lviv. Icon of Christ with Ukrainian national symbols and artillery bombardment pieces and bullets on the display. It was a Greek Catholic church in Lviv. I was there in 2018, and this is a Jesus with a bullet part in his head, put on a display at the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate in Dnepr. And you can see here that there is a significant presence of different, national symbols. And then we have the creation of the church, of the new church, to give you this kind of the political rationale behind. There were different demands. There were different demands for a different level for the autocephaly, but somehow this particular was most successful, and we will try to understand what explains that. So the newly formed church constituted basically the fusion of essentially two churches plus a few bishops and clergy from the Russian Orthodox Church, but overwhelmingly the Kiev Patriarchate and Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. So the new church was formed, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which actually got Thomas in 2019. Now, this is a historical moment again, right? The autocephaly, the Patriarch of Constantinople is signing, and you have seen here the Metropolitan of Ukraine in the background. So these events, there is obviously the question which many ask. So why now that given previous efforts of the Ukrainian government and clerical elites of applying for autocephaly failed to deliver it? So why was this particularly successful, right? First, one might argue that Ukrainian autocephaly became a matter of competition and prestige between, on the one hand, the Russian Orthodox Church, and on the other hand, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. The competition for the status of perhaps the dominant church in the Orthodox world. Russian Orthodox Church had the largest canonical territory, although the greater share of its parishes, again, as we showed here, are located on the Ukrainian territory. So despite the lack of formal power of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which we know there is no pope in Orthodox Christianity, so there is no central authority. All these autocephalous churches having patriarchs are pretty much having their own popes. So there is no one CEO of all churches, if you will. So there is this, despite the lack of this formal power of the Patriarch of Constantinople, over other autocephalous churches, his rank is still what many of the Orthodox churches refer to as primus inter pares, meaning the first among equals. So he's considered to be the successor of the Andrew the Apostle. But yet again, beyond the symbolical part, the ecumenical patriarch does not possess legal power over other autocephalous churches. There is, one might say, argue that Ukraine was kind of the test field for the patriarch to demonstrate or perpetuate its power against the Russian Orthodox Church. Or another possibility why this worked at this time but failed, for example, previously when other presidents requested that, is the implication of the responses of the Orthodox churches of Ukraine to the domestic and political processes on the public opinion. For example, how churches responded to the Euromaidan revolution allegedly greatly influenced the public opinion on their status in society, which could have shaped an overall opinion of the ecumenical patriarch on the future of Christianity in Ukraine. So again, the polls which great Ukrainian sociologists have done across 18 years from 2000 to 2018, again, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate reached its highest support and showed a steady increase as opposed to decline of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate over the last decades. So the decline was from 34.5% in 2010 to 19.1% in 2018, again, according to the Razumkov centers. So to take this, again, to illustrate this example, during Euromaidan, for example, on very symbolical level, Kiev Patriarchate opened the doors of the cathedral to the protesters, and the church's spaces were used for hospitals for the wounded during the government attacks. Again, the Kiev Patriarchate framed its narrative on national identity as being, in a way, standing by the people, being the church of the people, by the people of Ukraine during the most difficult times. The church was there, the mother church was there. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, on the other hand, opted to an extent to a relatively neutral, anti-revolutionary stance in the beginning. During Euromaidan, which was again interpreted very hostile to the cause of the revolution, later on, as the war escalated and an annexation of Crimea happened, the church definitely took sides, and that perhaps was the factor, as my own research showed, why people understood the role of Tomos of autocephaly the way they did. Anyway, we go back to the sort of the trajectory, right? To summarize what I've been talking about, the political context and engagement of the political elites were very significant factors. Address of the president and the parliament, and consensus in the ruling party that we as a Ukrainian state, as Ukrainian people, have to have our own church, and the public support, or perhaps the sense among the elites, the need of the autocephaly, but again, arguing hindsight with hindsight, politically speaking. So now what I would like to do, if you still can hear me, is to divide you in small groups, and not to bore you too much with my talk, just ask you the question, so what was so geopolitical about this autocephaly? What's your take? Again, speaking from your backgrounds, if you have heard about Ukrainian autocephaly, this issue was straight away linked to geopolitics. And the second part of my conversation will be just about that. But let's have a quick group discussion, unless you're really, really against that. Have a small group discussion to just give us the sense of, okay, so what was so geopolitical? If we're talking about Ukraine having its own church, what's the geopolitical dimension of it? And if there is a geopolitical dimension, on what level does this operate?
Oh, okay.
All right.
Thank you.
So we're back from our discussions in the breakout rooms in this Zoom era. We had a short pause, if you will, of recording, and then we're having this discussion in the larger group, and we're trying to understand the geopolitical dimensions. So what's so geopolitical about autocephaly was essentially the question we asked. And And we will have now the discussion and in the groups. Let me just start from the group number 1, which is with Augustine, Jan, Oksana, and Stephen. Whoever wants to start from group 1, please, floor is yours. Maybe you can summarize it quickly, give us the recap of your argument, and we'll move on to the next group. So group 1.
Okay, maybe I'll just give a brief summary. Geopolitical because it's mostly because of the location and of the history that we have lived in. And of course money issues, financial issues. So it's struggle for power.
Okay. Thank you very much. Were there other points in the group which you think maybe Jan or Stephen, Augustine, which were very important to mention here in the larger group? What makes this whole autocephaly so geopolitical? If it's just about the nation having its own church, why it should be such a big issue?
Well, I think there was also another issue, another point that we talked about. There was the element of what do I say? No, I'm not. I may have difficulty explaining many of these churches, but let me just use. Maybe there was the church in Moscow. That's the Orthodox Church in Moscow lost a bit of influence or power over the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Patriarch of the Orthodox. That term. Sorry, I couldn't get all the terms well.
Very accurate. Thank you very much, Augustine. We move on now to the other group: Emanuele, Jan, Matthew, and Mig. If you want, whoever wants to start, give us a 2-minute summary of what was the argument, and please.
I think a general theme was that in Eastern Christianity, there's always this conflict over how close the religious and the secular should be. Like, should priests be allowed to run for political parties? There's the problem of ethnophilitism, right? Should nationalities dictate like church boundaries and so on and so forth? Yeah, that's what I have, but I'm not sure if anyone else wants to contribute.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other points?
Something we also talked about briefly was that historically speaking, especially in more recent years, there's this understanding of Russia in particular being an outside aggressor, and with and the perception, whether correct or incorrect, being that the Russian Orthodox Church is an extension almost of that aggression. And so, having an autocephalous church serves as a statement of independence, if you would, against that perceived aggression.
Excellent. Very, very interesting point. Thank you for mentioning that. I'll go now to the group 3 with George, Jan, Silwen, Viola, and Vit. Whoever wants to start, maybe 2 speakers like in the previous groups, to give us a quick recap of the argument. The floor is yours.
I can start. I don't know how my colleagues, but maybe they will add some notes. But for me, 2 important geopolitical points. Making a national church is kind of a symbol of making a national state, and have some natural border between Europe and Russian sphere of influence is, just from the historical perspective, somehow important. So that's one point. And another for me is another geopolitical point of view, that Christianity itself is geopolitical actor, and making and divide Christianity in smaller and smaller group is somehow making Christianity weaker. So just weakening our Christian position in a world geopolitics.
Excellent, very interesting point. Thank you very much for that. Maybe another point from the group, one more, and we'll move on to the group 4.
I think that it is mixed problem in the Ukraine because Ukraine is this border between east or west, and produce the problem in this country. And I think that it is the geopolitical, political, and religion problem in the one group.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jan. And with this, we'll move to the group 4 and ask them to give us a few thoughts. So it's Hadje, Jan, John, and Tomasz. So whoever is for a quick recap.
Should I maybe start? Okay, so we, among other things, wondered mainly about how similar is this situation to the situation in the Czechoslovakia in 1920s, when actually independent Protestant, quasi-Protestant church was formed by secession from the Catholic Church, and we actually came to conclusion that perhaps the only one who makes autocephaly a real geopolitical problem are the Russians, because in the case of Czechoslovakia, Austrians actually didn't care about some independent Czechoslovakian church, and only real problem there was that Czechoslovakia didn't have had relations with Vatican, but it wasn't a geopolitical problem. It was some state-to-state problem. So.
Very interesting point about status, which we really are taking very seriously in sociology. Thanks very much, Tomasz. So maybe John, Jan, or Hadje want to talk about some key points?
Sure, yeah. I think a lot of what we discussed and going what Tomasz said was basically it seems that Russia, or the perceived aggressive threat of Russia is what's forcing this to be such a geopolitical issue. And I mean, that's sort of just repeating what Tomasz said, but I think that was the main takeaway that our group had.
Yeah, I don't have much to add because that main idea was, which Tomasz mentioned, basically creation of the Czechoslovak independent church as the reaction on separation from Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Russian aggressivity and sort of nationalism is one of the main components in that game in Ukraine. I mentioned also one remark, which is maybe also little bit geopolitical issue between Constantinople and Moscow Church, maybe. That can be also issue which we should consider.
Yeah, absolutely. There is the issue of prestige and power, as well as the sort of the historical rivalry for the Kievan Rus between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church. So thanks, Ian, for this argument. Now I move to the group 5 with Dmitro, Katarzyna, Martina, and Mira. So whoever is willing to share thoughts, please, floor is yours.
Okay, I may start as a Ukrainian probably here. So yes, one of the evidences of geopolitical cause of autocephaly of Ukrainian Church, current OCU, is that a lot of presidents, probably 2 or 3 presidents before Poroshenko applied to Bartholomew to get this so-called Thomas, but only during Poroshenko presidency, in this hard time during war, we got that Thomas, right? So what is Thomas? Thomas is the sign, is one of the tools in this hybrid war. Because hybrid war, we have this war not only in the territory of Donbass. We have the main battle is in minds of Ukrainians, you know. So and it's very important to to control the minds, right? Who control the mind controls the territory. So probably that's the part of geopolitical war, and it's from the side of Ukraine is some kind of defense, I would say, because as many researchers found already that Russian Church, but you don't have to be a researcher to see that the Russian Church promotes Ruski Mir ideology and anti-Ukrainian sentiments towards Ukrainians, and it's really destructive behavior. So surely it's a part of big geopolitical game, and it's not over yet.
Thanks, Dmitro, for your perspective. And maybe Katerina or Martina and Mira would like to add something to what Dmitro said.
No, it's a very good recapitulation about our talking. I think the same. It's a political game and geopolitics aspects, especially after the reason of Thomas, I think, is the revolution of dignity, the situation in Crimea, East Ukraine, and it is one of the elements of political game, and in situation when we had a president election between Poroshenko, the game between Poroshenko and Zelensky. I think it's two aspects of this game, geopolitical and president election game.
Excellent, very interesting factor analysis, Katerina. So I'll move to the next group now with group 6, and we have Bogdan, Katerina, Sofia, and Vera. And as promised, we start from Vera, if you're willing to kick off the discussion from your group.
Microphone, please.
Oh, I was muted. Very simple.
No,
I forgot to switch it on, turn it on. So we had different ideas, and Sofia, maybe she would tell, she even mentioned some historical moments beginning from Mazepa. Maybe she can say about it. And just I wanted to mention why that I understood it, this Thomas was somehow, the idea was to legalize Ukrainian church and to minimize Russian influence. So, and your question was why it didn't work, why people don't want to have one national church. And I think that this big post-Soviet period, when people, our church and our believers so mentioned church, understood religion issues and problems like very symbolically, and they never didn't have relationships with God, and had it like only like symbolically, and tradition. Just they see it more like tradition, and if it's good to say, like, are quite ignorant, especially these Orthodox believers, and they don't mind which they don't distinguish these churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's why, and that is a problem with people, and then of course in this hierarchy. The problem is power, as it was mentioned before, and churches, buildings, and possession. I don't know, but this geopolitical, it's of course aggression. I think it's Russian aggression, but someone can add the comment.
Thanks, Vera, for a very nuanced response. And now we have Bogdan, Katerina, or Sofia, whoever wants to join Vera in summarizing the group discussion.
At the same time, Ukraine has a specific position because this country is between West and East. and everything which happens in the church context, in political context, has an impact on the foreign politics of a rank of European countries, or it has an impact on a geopolitical situation in the Orthodox East.
Thank you very much, all of you. And now, if you have comments about what each group said, please voice them now. If not, I'll move to my part. So if you want to comment on something that was said in the group, so you can move on, or you raise your hand, use the reaction button. And if there is no comment to what has been already said, then I'll move on. Okay, I understand there is no willingness to comment, and I'll use my time to actually move on as we're running out of time. So now you can see my screen, I hope. Okay, I see. Yeah, we're back now with the very simple response, which you actually showed already in your analysis. Well, Kremlin cared. The question is, why did Kremlin care so much that it involved into the soft power on so many levels against the autocephaly? On different levels, from Russia Today up to Guardian, in getting into this analysis, saying that, well, Ukraine could soon cease to be a country. Russian Security Council Secretary Patrushev said, giving an interview to The Guardian, how important is for the statehood, even for the national security of Russian Federation, with Putin being the head of the National Security Council meeting, and the topic of the meeting was the Ukrainian autocephaly. So there were really big political and geopolitical strategies. And as you showed already, Russian state really cared about Ukrainian religious matters, largely because of this significance of Ukraine, this kind of geospatial imaginary of what Russian world idea of Ruski Mir is. And this is the transcript of the conversation between the Patriarch Kirill and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, actually before the Thomas, very much before the Thomas, I think it was in summer 2018. This was never denied and never confirmed, but yet again, this was leaked in the media, and so it was largely circulated across the Orthodox world, if you will. So Ecumenical Patriarch says, why is his rational basically to give Thomas? And then there is the response of Patriarch Kirill, which is very interesting. We have never abandoned the notion that we're one country and one people. It is impossible for us to separate Kiev from our country, as this is where our history began. The Russian Orthodox Church preserves the national consciousness of both Russians and Ukrainians. Again, back to the elephant in the room. Some of you have mentioned this concept of Ruski Mir, Russian world. I define it as sort of the synthesis of idea, ideology, and the project, right? But looking at what Patriarch Kirill himself spoke about the opening of the Russian World Organization, he said, quote, "The basis of the Russian world today is Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus." And St. Lavrenti Chernigovsky expressed this idea with the famous phrase, "Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, this is all Rus." Despite being divided by the state borders and incompatibilities with certain policies, we continue to remain spiritually one nation. So again, the theme which is coming back again, this idea of unnecessary obstacles for us as one people, and the Russian world as somewhat the framework which kind of gets us together, if you will. Another cornerstone, Patriarch Kirill says, of the Russian world is culture and language. Russians, Tatars, Ukrainians, and Georgians can belong to Russian culture because it's absorbed traditions of many people. Russian culture is a phenomenon that does not fit within the borders of one state. So there is this idea of transnational, of supranational idea of this project. So if we zoom into that and then we say, well, Ruski Mir as an idea functions as the sort of as a space, if you will, in which the physical territorial borders are relative. And it is about common historical memory, culture, and religion and language. Ruski Mir as a project is a predisposition to believe in alternative reality in a way. Alternative reality in this case means that reality in which factuality is relative. and national boundaries and sovereignty and territory in nation state are diminished by the historical and cultural relativism. But a Ruski Mir as an ideology is a culturally significant framework which legitimizes a profound and fundamental rejection of the Western values. And yet again, Timothy Snyder does a great job on this, and there are other scholars who study this, Merlin, Laruelle, and others on a very macro level. So what is the United States Unified Church discourse? On a rhetorical level, again, not to too much overwhelm you with quotes, again, the idea is linked to very much to the national security. So again, there is not only religious significance, but also political significance attached to this. Yeah, a very famous quote by President Poroshenko: "A body cannot be free when the soul is in captivity." So the church that blesses Putin's hybrid war against Ukraine, which prays day in, day out for the Russian authorities and for the army, is also Russian. So where are the people in this whole geopolitical struggle? People are in a way in between of this. And I've been in 22 settlements in Ukraine, 8 regions, interviewed 77 people, but in the first phase, and later I moved on to other parts, getting to 102 interviews. So these were more or less the map which were representing the transfers from Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine to the Kiev Patriarchate, or later the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the newly created Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And if you can notice here, it's a very much the Western Ukrainian phenomena, if you will, the scale of it. And then the question is, if, of course, the first question, what one might say is that, okay, how people choose whether they want to stay in the church or move to the other church. What does it mean to the people? What does it mean to the people? How do they identify with the one church or the other? And what does Ruski Mir mean to the ordinary communities which are taking place, which are taking part in these changes? And how is this Ruski Mir practiced in daily life as opposed to the United States Unified Church discourse which is again advocated by the Ukrainian political elites? So again, we have a lot of quotations from different parts of Ukraine, and I will be very quickly skimming through them to get to the gist of the kind of the theoretical argument. But very often the response of the priests to the tragedies of war was a very important factor and determinant on how actually people perceived the Eliot discourses, right? So again, it is the quote from the parishioner, and which says, well, they, in talking about the priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, they prayed in Russian. They prayed for Kirill, and basically they disregarded our heavenly hundred. So how can we be with them? And one of the most witty ones was, McDonald's operates more than 100 countries, but the taste of Big Mac is pretty much the same. So it was kind of ironically reflecting to the idea of Russian world. But what does it mean to the ordinary people if you cannot commit to, for example, parishioner 3 in Dnepropetrovsk basically said, you cannot commit to dying for Ukraine and pray for Moscow at the same time. So it became an either or question. Then the question, of course, becomes, if religion is an important feature of national identity in Ukraine, then why this interconfessional changes were not en masse? Why the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine did not lose entirely, almost entirely, or significantly its parishioners, and why was it interconfessional transfers in a way gradually stopping after the elections? So we have the dynamic which actually shows exactly that. And an important part of the field work which I find out was the language and commemorative practice. So, for example, when the priest commemorated the victims of the war or executed service in Ukrainian language, parishioners very often were not even aware. I think even Vera mentioned that they were not very much aware which church was that, whether it was a church of Moscow Patriarchate or a Kiev Patriarchate, because the bond, the close bond between the people and the priest was very much more important than the macro narrative, whether this church was Ukrainian Orthodox Church or it was actually the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. What mattered to the parishioners, for example, in one of the villages in Cherkasy region, was the building of the church. Again, it was symbolical, a wooden transfiguration church built in 18th century, and church building remained of the highest importance, as one of the respondents said. But again, the question is, however, the parishioners interpreted very often the character of commemorative practice as disrespectful to the memory of the victims of ongoing war. Again, in different villages, in Ternopil, for example, where I spent months, the tension between the divided co-villagers continued for months and months and months. But the conflict was between parishioners of the Moscow church and the Kievan church, or the church of Great Martyr St. George, or etc. The parishioners took control of the church building, but they started to build a new church approximately 300 meters away from the old one. And the reason for takeover of the church, in the words of the organizer, was the response of the priests to the local protest against the commemoration of Patriarch Kirill during the weekly service. So very much people were unhappy to hear Kirill's name in the commemoration, Patriarch Kirill's name, and because Patriarch Kirill was very often associated with the kind of the geopolitical narrative of Kremlin. Again, parishioners associated him with Putin regime, and hearing that in Russian language, quote one of the informants said, well, boys were killed in the war against Russia, was yet another triggering factor for the takeover. So again, the family members of this special riot police officers in different parts allegedly took part in dissemination of Maidan protest. Again, where there were a lot of finger pointing on each other in each other's past during the Euromaidans. So there was a lot of rural conflicts. The nature of the conflict was very much linked to the urban-rural divide. When there was one church in the village, there was not a lot of choice that people had. When one church changes the jurisdiction, there is conflict. But in urban Ukraine, this was not an issue because there are so many churches. People can kind of flexibly change the interdenominations, if you will. So there was where can we get with this? And I have to finish. I realize that I'm running out of time. So I like this last quote from this respondent in I think it was Western Ukraine, I believe. So why shall I be either in there or here? She asked. I used to go to the church which was closer to my house because sometimes I have swollen legs and it's hard to move. And suddenly we're now the Orthodox, we're now the Ukrainians. And I have to ignore an eye contact with my neighbor if I go one way, or angry my relative if I go another way. So I will remain as a declarative believer, she said. And I think was a really fascinating point, a declarative believer, a believer on paper, basically. So yeah, so where does it lead us to, if we can theorize a little bit on this? One dimension of this is what I call the identitarian in-betweenness, as opposed to, for example, what we know in sociology as multiple identities, when people can identify with a few or several identities at the same time. Identitarian in-betweenness is the hybrid category of practice. It is characterized by this undecidedness in this narratives or motivation for interconfessional change or fluctuation in religious behavior. Identitarian betweenness occurs in response to this, what I called elsewhere hybrid nationalism, when people are intentionally or unintentionally forced to choose one identity over the other, to choose one identity, what is pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, and this sort of the binary categories over the other. And the discourse of Ukrainian political elites put category of religion as a vital element of Ukrainian national security and statehood. But as the argument goes, we can say, well, if one is patriotic, one is Ukrainian enough, the choice is between being pro-Ukrainian and loyal to the cause of freedom, or being pro-Russian and anti-national. Very often these choices were the reason why people actually stayed in between of these categories. So the secular identity of Ukrainian state, I argue, is still volatile and fluid. So these elite narratives have very diverging implications. And I think I'll not elaborate too much on my forthcoming book, which will be talking about the sentimental or orthodoxy, which I argue is a helpful mechanism which explains why intergroup conflict doesn't lead to violence in Ukraine. But now I'll stop here and I'll save the time for discussion. If there are questions, please voice them now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So questions, about what we talked about, or I can elaborate a little bit more why parishioners typically switch from one church to another and under what circumstances they actually stayed loyal. But I prefer to hear what your thoughts are. So I have two questions now, starting from Katarzyna and Augustine.
Okay, thank you. In the end, I want to comment on one moment. I think that while we have this discussion about geopolitics, in my opinion, the question is why the Orthodox Church in Moscow is playing this political game. In Poland, we say that if you don't know what is it, it's about money. Yeah, I think that it's about money. The church in Moscow, I think, cares about influence, about transfer of money and transfer of priests from Ukraine. And that's my comment only. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, the idea of kind of commercial part of this is definitely an important one. But if we look at the formal part, and yeah, it's difficult to very often measure what is actually behind the curtains, because usually these donations are under the carpet to the churches. So it's very difficult to actually track down the sources. But beyond money, I think there is a lot of ideology involved. And ideology, what Patriarch Kirill himself described as this idea of us being one people, notwithstanding the ethnicity, creating this idea of supranational space, cultural space, if you will, is a very important one. And the question, of course, is why did Poroshenko team invested so much money and time and political capital in the religion in these elections, in the previous elections? Why did they care so much about the Tomos and not the roads in Beloziria or the roads or infrastructure, I don't know, in the middle of other villages, which are really broken and economically very, very much lagging behind the urban centers? So why was this such a big issue? And maybe this is the question which kind of triggers this. What was the geopolitical response of the Ukrainian state to the Russian world? Was it, oh, we will create even bigger macro narrative? Or perhaps it could have been, well, we will actually provide roads instead of giving the Thomas so much effort. We'll do something more practical. But on the argument of Poroshenko and his colleagues in the church, also his supporters, was that, well, we need this kind of bigger macro category which will unite Ukraine, because one of the theories is that, well, if you want to understand Ukraine, it's about regionalism. It's not about two Ukraines, as one prominent scholar argued, but it's about regionalism. So it's about this complexity of different cultural influences, of geopolitics, of geography, of river, if you will, rivers, and many other historical moments which compose this beautiful country. So if you want to understand that, well, religion, it was never historically so significant as opposed to language, as opposed to region. So the question is, why did Poroshenko people underestimated the importance of other features and overestimated religion as a macro category? And I agree with you that, well, money perhaps was an issue for Russian state, and we know billionaires behind the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, multi-billionaires were pouring a lot of money in the church in Ukraine. But perhaps there was something beyond that, and this was this ideological framework, which I think was very efficient for advocating the Russian geopolitical agenda. Thank you, Katrina. So it's Augustine.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mine is not really a question. It's just from a peace building perspective. I'm someone who is very interested in issues in the grassroots, because we deal with bringing about peace and restoring peace in local communities. So I was very fascinated by the research that you did, especially to see how this all plays out in the minds of the ordinary Christians. I do not know if there is any other literature that you can recommend, or you can share with us one or two links so that we can explore that bit more, because I think there could be people who are really, really interested in really hearing or understanding how this all plays out to the ordinary Ukrainian on the street, or going to church or going around in the market or anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augustine. I promised Father Roman about that, so I'll definitely I'll send the I think very interesting articles. And this theme is very much understudied. And also in my next book, I'm working on why these polarizing, conflicting discourses do not lead to intergroup violence in times of organizational discontent. So there is this crisis. People are changing from one church to another, but why there is no violence actually? Although the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin-affiliated press portrays the narrative of the land grabbing of the churches, legally speaking, there's a lot of property disputes between the two churches, but there is not a lot of violence between people. So there shall be something with role of religion as a preventer of violence in this case, as a religion, as a sort of playing very much Durkheimian sort of the positivist role, rather than being the antagonist as is being portrayed. So I'm puzzled with that. And whether it's formal or informal relationships and practices between parishioners and priests, whether this is affectual attachment to the parish, to the personality of priest, I'll figure it out later. But I think there is an interesting dimension on different levels, whether symbolic meaning or historical meaning of the church buildings or family ties, because in the absence of civil society in the rural Ukraine, churches are the places where people actually meet. They're creating even families and bonds in the spaces, because one space in the small village in the middle of Ukraine somewhere, or in the outskirts of Western Ukraine or North Ukraine or Carpathians, is actually the church. The church creates the sense of civil society in a way, because that's where action happens. That's where fun is. You go to the church, you sing, you have this chemistry between people, you have the sentiments on different levels. And I think that's the very interesting answer. And Ukraine gives us a fantastic field of study, because it's so diverse and so culturally so significantly different from part to part. We have Mig. If I pronounce your name incorrectly, I apologize for that. So floor is yours.
Mega, Joshua Mega.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the famous saying that we have around is that when you have a problem in a community, a priest has something to do with it. The Christian communities, because my experience of this from a common point of view, if, for instance, in a local community, a bishop has something to communicate, if he gets the priests to understand it, then it will go to the people in the right way. But if they don't understand it, then it will not be communicated in the right way. So I think it is high time also that as we talk about the geopolitical issues, then we need also to understand the background from which, and let's say the church community are being formed. Because if we address also the issue of formation, how they are formed into priesthood, then that religious background will help them to have one message on the pulpit. And when somebody goes to the other church, he'll get the same message. He goes to the other church, he gets the same message. Then that will bring, it's a comment that I'm thinking about, because the world can have their own language. But when we in the church who have decided to offer leadership to the people have a different perspective, then you can imagine how this thing will spread like a bushfire, and it will be the knot that will tie the ecumenical endeavor in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I think I'll add to that that personal attachment to the priest adapts or changes depending on how the clergy responds to the tragedies of war, how they use the language, whether you use Ukrainian language in the church prayer or not, whether you use Old Church Slavonic, for example, or how do they contribute to the community service? I have a lot of the responses from interviewers where they were happy with the priest because he was helping with, I don't know, carrying the potatoes from the field or taking care to come every day to see the wounded families and etc. So a lot is about the personal role of agency, if you will, and contribution to what Bourdieu called the symbolical capital of the religious field is very much dependent on the local responses. And I agree with your point, what you said. I think there was a question before, Tomasz, in the chat, I think from Oksana. So the question is, have there been samples of similar divisions anywhere in the world and history? And if so, where they resolved? And is there any algorithm that will most probably be followed in Ukraine? I think Ukraine is very unique in the post-Soviet space in a number of ways. One of which is that its religious field is unparalleled in terms of plurality. It's one of the most plural. It's like, you know, it's like America of the former Soviet Union, and I think Europe, in the sense of the religious competition on the market, because you have so many religious groups and the law is by default very liberal. There is no one church that actually has the prevalence over the other. Unlike any other Orthodox church in the world, Ukraine is different from all of them, because in almost all churches across the world, there is one Orthodox church which is hegemonic. In Ukraine, there is no such church. And legally speaking, there couldn't be, because on no number of levels, the constitutional setup is being created. And I think if Ukrainian democracy wants to flourish, that shall be at any cost maintained, of course, because it's such an important default setting, which allows Ukraine to be having this legal system, which favors the plurality. And another question, I think, was from Tomasz now. I'll go back to the chat later. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope audio will be okay because storm just started here. So I'm sorry if something goes wrong with audio. If I were to simplify the whole thing, is autocephaly unacceptable for the Russians because it is incompatible with the concept of Ruski Mir, and it is de facto defeat in Moscow Constantinople dispute? Or if I put it in another way, in your opinion, if there was no ideology in the background, would there be a conflict over autocephaly at all?
A very good question, Tomasz. I think you got it spot on, but I would add one dimension that for Russian Orthodox Church, Ukraine is a very strategic place because of the amount of parishes which the Russian Orthodox Church has on the territory of Ukraine. If these parishes are gone, the Russian Church is no more the largest church in the world, because overwhelming majority of parishes are not located in Russian soil, but are actually on the Ukrainian territory. So if these parishes are converted to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and I think the first question with Katerina was, what about the business? There's the huge economical infrastructure which goes with that. Because if Ukraine or Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the newly created church, has all of these parishes, which have its own monasteries, which have its own tourism and candles and icons and number of religious infrastructure, which gives money to the Moscow church, then definitely it's going to be a huge economical shot to the Russian Orthodox Church. Ideologically speaking, this idea of being the kind of the third Rome is very significant. Without Ukraine, without Ukrainian space, which means that at this point, Russian Orthodox Church has the metropolitanate of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is a huge one. But actually, without it, if this is converted to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, again, there is no more third Rome thing, because you're one of the others. And this position of being a hegemonic power, being the dominant player in the Orthodox world, is what basically defines Russian nationalism for centuries. And if there is no hegemony in this Orthodox world, then there is no Russian state, as the logic goes, because this is so much in close symbiosis with each other and so much historically intertwined all the way from the 17th century and later, especially under the Tsarist in the 18th century and later even during the communism.